Franklin learned through polio to project into the area of suffering, which might be for a different reason. And it was very valuable when the New Deal came along, and the problems that you had to meet were before you. He understood what people were suffering, even though it was an entirely different area from which he had had any experience.
In this series of heritage programs, we are privileged to meet Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt and her guests, Dr. Clarence Kramer, Dean of Adelbert College, Western Reserve University, and Mr. Henry Morgenthau III. In this second program, we visit with Mrs. Roosevelt to hear of her life with FDR.
President Truman's there.
Mrs. Roosevelt, undoubtedly, during the major portion of your adult life, the greatest influence on all of your activities was your husband and his career. Can you recollect your first meeting with FDR, what sort of person he was then?
I'm afraid I can only recollect that first meeting because I was told about it. I went with my father and mother at the age of 2 to stay at Hyde Park, and Franklin is supposed to have ridden me round the nursery on his back, but I don't really remember it. And my first real recollection of my husband is when I came back from school abroad. I came back once during the 3 years I was there, and I happened to be on a train going up to Tivoli, where my grandmother lived, and I was surprised to see a young man walking down the aisle who stopped and spoke to me, and it turned out to be Franklin, who was going to Hyde Park with his mother. And he took me back to see his mother, and then I went back, and then I did not see him again for a long while. In the meantime, I had seen him before that once at a Christmas party. We all used to go to Christmas parties at Orange to my Aunt Mrs. Robinson. And I was always very shy because my aunts wanted to dress me. I was tall and lanky, but they wanted to dress me with very short dresses, and I was terribly conscious of this, and very grateful because this young Franklin danced with me. But that was the only intermediate meeting.
What sort of young man was he at this period?
Oh, I think he was just a happy, well-educated, rather spoiled probably because his mother and father had no other child, but he'd been given extraordinary opportunities for education, really extraordinary opportunities.
I mean, did he show any indication of interest in a public career or interest in
Well, he was very much
problems?
interested in Uncle Ted. And when he was in college, of course, I think it was largely Uncle Ted's influence that started him feeling that you had an obligation to do something politically, because Uncle Ted at that time was telling all young men that they should do something in the political field, and that had quite an effect on Franklin.
He knew Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh, yes.
How did Uncle Ted and your husband reconcile their political differences?
Well, I don't know that they ever did, except, of course, I think that Franklin voted for Uncle Ted, and I think he believed in a great many of the things that Uncle Ted preached at that time, which were, of course, radical differences with the old Republican line. And Uncle Ted, after all, was called everything possible by his contemporaries. And Franklin later was to be called much the same things by some of Uncle Ted's children even. And but somehow between them, at that early time, there were very few differences. They were very much interested in much the same things.
Uncle Ted, who was then president, was of course at your wedding, wasn't he?
Oh yes, he gave me away at my wedding because he was my godfather. And we had the wedding on the 17th of March because he had to come up for the St. Patrick's Parade to New York. And that meant that almost everybody had difficulty getting to the wedding, and even he himself. And then when he did arrive, the wedding was actually over, we suddenly discovered that the minute Uncle Ted left us and went into another room, everybody else left us too, and so we had to follow into the other room. It was really much more important that Uncle Ted was there than that we were being married.
Mm-hmm. In other words, he was the star of the show.
He was the star of the show, and Frank never quite forgot it. It didn't bother me at all, but Frank never quite forgot it, and when he was president, he would always refuse to go to the marriages of the young members of the family because he said he did not wish to have their marriage overshadowed by his presence.
When did FDR begin to have a political career himself? What was the beginning?
Well, he actually began. He was in a law firm in New York, a very good old established law firm, and Carter Ledger in Milburn, and he was offered the impossible task of running for office in Dutchess County. No Democrat had ever been elected in 32 years. And it just happened that that year was a Democratic sweep, and he got in. Otherwise, I don't think he would have started then at all. But he did get in, and he made a very vigorous campaign. He, for the first time, used an automobile, and it was red. You could see it a mile away, and open. And he had a man called Hawkey who drove it. And they just toured, having to stop every time they met a horse, because it made the farmers angry if their horses were upset. And horses got very much upset those days. And so his campaign was a series of stopping for the horses and arriving at small villages and getting out and talking to all the farmers and meeting everybody. He wasn't a very good speaker in those early days. There would be horrible long pauses, and I would wonder whether he was ever going on again. But he learned, and he did know his own district and their needs very well by the end of the campaign, and he won by a very good vote.
Your statement that he wasn't a very good speaker in those days seems surprising because of his magnificent voice in the 30s.
Yes, but all that improved as he went on. It was more a question of just lack of experience and I think real fear probably of his own ability to say the things that he had to say. But he would pause and think of what he wanted to say next, and it was quite painful. But he always went on. I used to think sometimes he was never going on, but he always did.
Did his mother oppose a political career for him?
Yes, she didn't like the idea at all. She thought it was rather beneath a young, well-bred young American to be going into state politics. And she didn't like the idea at all. Neither did she like the kind of people that began to come to our house. But she bore up under it.
She never actually tried to prevent his career.
No, she never really tried to prevent it. She didn't approve, and she would talk sometimes in a derogatory manner about politics, but she never really interfered.
Louis Howe believed very early that FDR would be president.
Well, apparently he did. Of course, he first knew FDR in Albany, and apparently he made up his mind quite early that this was someone who had material for being president, and he worked for it. And Louis Howe knew that he himself was never going to be a man of great power, but he was determined to make somebody over whom he had influence a really powerful person. And he had remarkable qualities, Louis Howe. He was totally devoted to the idea that he had decided upon, and completely loyal and very able, and a newspaper man, steeped in politics. And he was a remarkable advisor, and Franklin really benefited greatly from his advice over a long period of years.
Were there others who shared this confidence of Howe?
I don't think there was anyone who had quite the position of Louis Howe. Louis Howe had an ability to contradict, which, as time went on, fewer and fewer people had. Now later, of course, after Louis died, Harry Hopkins more or less filled a certain gap in his life. But by that time, Franklin was set in his own feeling about his own ability to handle politics, and there wasn't anyone who was going to have the same influence in molding him that Louis had had. And I don't think really there was anybody else. He had a great many people around him who had some influence, but I don't think there was anyone else who had as much.
Did Howe maintain his confidence even after the polio attack?
Oh, more than ever, because he was the one person really who insisted that he was not through, that he was going back into politics. And then his mother did really try to have him become a country squire and live at Hyde Park and make no effort. And it was Howe's determination that brought him, that finally made him feel that this was something he could do and would do.
On the other hand, it's been said that during this illness, perhaps the illness itself and the fact that he had a great deal of time to contemplate and think about what he was going to do, that it was during this period that Roosevelt changed almost completely. Do you feel that this has been exaggerated?
I don't think he changed completely. There were certain things that were always there. But he certainly learned to understand what suffering meant in a way that he'd never known before. And he certainly gained enormously in patience. And that was something which served him very well, because if you have to wait months to know whether the decision you've made in polio is the right decision, you have to remember that in those days less was known about the treatment of polio. So if he decided that he was going to try a certain thing, he had no certainty that that was the right thing, and he might wait 6 months before he knew whether it was helpful or not. Well, now, curiously enough, I think that gave him some of the patience that was needed to meet the problems, both of the New Deal and the war. Because I've heard people say to him, but if we do this, we don't know if we will be successful. And I've seen my husband time after time say, there are very few things we can know beforehand. We will try, and if we find we are wrong, we will have to change. And I think that grew out of his polio experience, because he couldn't know, and he would have to be ready to change. And things like that, I think, it had an enormous difference, and it gave him time to read. He read enormously during that period, and he met all kinds of people and talked with them. I think he made it a very fruitful time, in spite of the fact that most people felt it was a lost period. And the knowledge of suffering and having to bear it probably had a very broad influence on him, because he could understand how people could suffer in ways that he had not experienced. And that is one of the difficult things for most people, because most people can only understand the area of their own experience, And I think Franklin learned through polio to project into the area of suffering, which might be for a different reason. And it was very valuable when the New Deal came along, and the problems that you had to meet were before you. He understood what people were suffering, even though it was an entirely different area from which he had had any experience.
But it's also been said that you yourself had a great deal of influence on directing his interests, particularly towards social matters.
I know that's always been said. I think I was fortunate enough to have a number of interests that he had not been familiar with, and in my own experience, and then that gave him an opportunity to learn from me. Certain things, he was always curious, so he would take anything that you gave him which was something that he didn't know about. But I never felt that I had any influence at all in actually bringing about certain things, because he had a group of very able men, and that was set up really to find answers to the questions that he felt were important. And
who were some of these men? Who were these?
Well, Professor Tugwell and a great many people. Louis Howe used to pick up anyone he found and bring them in. Burley, Mr. Burley, and a number of people were round at that
and
time.
Harry Hopkins?
Harry Hopkins, quite a number.
Yes.
But
you mentioned a minute ago that Howe was one of the people who could contradict him. Hopkins apparently later on could do the same thing, even when he was president, and you think before you contradict the president.
Still Hopkins never contradicted in the way Louis did. Louis would be much more positive about something. Now, he wasn't always right, and as Franklin grew older, of course, he didn't always listen to Louis. But Louis had no hesitation in saying, there was a very amusing story that the office people once told me. Louis always had a horrible little office on Madison Avenue where all the state committee people worked. And his office, you could hear everything that went on in his office over the whole area where everybody was working. And one day he called Franklin, and he said, you always called him boss, and he said, boss, what you're doing is all wrong. Well, there was breathless silence through the office, and evidently Franklin went on and insisted on what he was doing, and he said, all right, go ahead and do it, it's suicide, go to hell, and he put the thing right down. Louis, I'm afraid, sometimes used language which is not permissible, but the whole office was enormously intrigued, and about half an hour later he called Franklin back, and perfectly serenely they talked about something quite different, as though nothing had been said.
Did you ever find yourself in disagreement with your husband on major political issues?
Oh, very often, but he wanted that very often. I mean, he would bring up at dinner a problem that everybody was bringing him different ideas on, and he would state what people were saying to him. And then that would get me all excited, and I would say, well, of course, I don't know anything except what I read in the papers and what the man in the street would say, but I feel thus and so. And he would egg me on, and never let me think that I was right. I've gone away sometimes so angry that I didn't know what to do. When Franklin would serenely tell me what everybody was arguing was giving him. And on one occasion in the White House, he asked me the next day, after we'd had a violent argument at dinner, would I have tea, that Ambassador Bingham, who was just about to leave for London, would come in for tea, and would I please give them both tea. So they came over, and I heard him, without giving me a look or the satisfaction of even behaving as though we'd ever mentioned it before, or telling him as instructions, my point of view, what I had told him the night before, was the way people felt, do you see? And I looked at him once, twice. He never gave me a look. And from that day on, he never mentioned it. And I never knew whether he really thought that this was the way he had felt right along, whether he really did feel that way right along and was just egging me on, do you see? But he never gave me the satisfaction of telling me.
Well, he had this uncanny knack of listening to all points of view and then coming to a conclusion of his own, didn't
Yes. He had that, and also it was unfortunate for some people because he never definitely said to anyone, I don't agree with you. He would listen and say, yes, yes, and they would go away thinking he agreed with them completely. And a lot of people thought they were just fooled. And it was just his way of not being disagreeable, but he wasn't committing himself.
Was it difficult for him to be unpleasant?
Oh, I think it was very difficult. He hated to be unpleasant. The only thing that he really never learned was how to be really unpleasant to anyone he cared about. If he got so angry with someone that he could be really unpleasant, then look out, because he was ruthless. And when that happened, I would hate to have been the one. I saw it with one person in all our years, just one person. And otherwise, he couldn't bear to tell anyone that he disliked what they had done, and please move on or move out. And I remember he had a man, a very nice man, who was his body servant for a long while, and excellent, but he got drunk. And Johnny was home, and Johnny went for him, and he was too drunk to come. And that upset the children, and they said, now he has to go. This was the second or third time this had happened. And so my husband waited. He liked him so much. And he waited till he was going on a cruise and taking in another man. And he said to me, while I'm gone, you get rid of so-and-so. There's a job for him over in the Treasury. But he never would tell him to go.
Did this sort of thing affect family discipline, too? I mean, was it difficult?
Yes. I disciplined Johnny once when he was a little boy. And I thought I'd sent him upstairs to his room. And I found him in Franklin's den, sitting on Franklin's lap, with his head buried in his shirt front, crying. And I went in, and Franklin looked as sheepish as Johnny should have looked. And he looked up at me and he said, you know, the poor child, he didn't really mean it.
He obviously had a saving sense of humor.
Oh, he had a
throughout
wonderful
these
sense of
difficult
humor.
years.
Wonderful sense of humor.
But occasionally he would lose it. That's a human thing to do.
Occasionally what?
He would lose the sense.
Yes, now and then.
But
Everybody does.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about this, the whole problem of bringing up a family in a sort of goldfish bowl. After all, you and your family probably were in the public eye longer than any other family in American history. How did you face this problem?
Well, the children, it was not so bad in their younger days. And by the time we were in Albany, they were all at school, boarding school or college. And that was no longer a difficult problem. It was hard for them, very hard for them, because they felt that they did no more than any other boy in college, and that they were always in the papers and always caught. And they thought this was really bad. I remember once trying to make out for Franklin Jr. that it wasn't so bad, because he didn't have, for instance, he had never been hungry, and he'd never had to work his way through college. He'd always had enough to eat, and he'd always had, after all, while this had brought him hardships, it had also brought him a good many advantages. But I wasn't met with any real appreciation of the argument. And I think it's awfully hard for the young. It's not so hard for the parents.
Was it hard for you when there was a great deal of criticism of the family, even though you knew it was politically motivated, yet it was so terribly personal?
You know, curiously enough, I never minded criticism much. I think I learned very young to know that everything passes. And if you just live it through, it comes to an end. And if there is criticism and there is a foundation of right in it, well then, it's fair criticism and you have to take it. If there is no foundation in it, well, sooner or later people are going to find it out. And in the meantime, it doesn't really matter much. The only thing I would mind would be if it really affected the people I love, people whose feeling of affection it really disturbed. That I would mind, but there are not many that I care that much about.
Beyond the winning of the World War, Mrs. Roosevelt, on the domestic side, what do you think were the greatest accomplishments in the New Deal period?
Of the period of the New Deal?
Of the period of the New Deal on the domestic side, domestic legislation.
Of course, the 100 Days legislation, which has laid the foundation for the comeback economically and has cushioned many semi-depressions since, they were all important. But I think really the vital thing that my husband did in domestic affairs was to make the people feel that they were a part of their government. He had the gift over the radio and to make them feel that he was talking to them in their living rooms and that he was telling them what the problems were and that they were a part of them and what they did really mattered. I think that was the most important thing he did, because that's what really pulled us out of the Depression, that sense of confidence that grew in what they could do if they went to work. And they went to work. He couldn't have done it. They did it.
We have been visiting with Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt and her guest, Dr. Clarence Kramer, Dean of Adelbert College, Western Reserve University, and Mr. Henry Morgenthau III. In Part 3 of this series, we shall visit again with Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Woman of Influence. The Heritage Series is a production of WQED Pittsburgh. This gift is given, and this our heritage.
This is National Educational Television.